Hi friends, welcome back. Today we're doing a two-part video. It's going to be how to teach a book in high school English. I'm Peter. This is my 18th year teaching. These are 11 tips in this first video that work for me. I should of course acknowledge that there's a lot of ways to do this right. These are 11 things that I think work. Your mileage may vary. Tip number 1, shoot for making a unit that lasts 3 or 4 weeks. I teach on a block schedule, which means I see my students every other day for about 85 minutes. I'll see them 5 times in 2 weeks. I'll see them 7 or 8 times in 3 weeks. 7 or 8 visits should be enough time to teach a short book like The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. A longer book might take 4 or 5 or even 6 weeks. A longer book like Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, I will teach in roughly 5 weeks with maybe some culminating activities that stretch into a 6th or 7th week. Typically at the beginning of the year, I think it's better to teach a shorter unit. And then later in the year, especially in the winter months, November, December, January, February, you can kind of stretch your students into those longer works. I do know some teachers who teach long works that take them 7 or 8 or 9 weeks to get through. I would much rather teach 2 or 3 works in 9 or 10 or 11 weeks. I feel like I get more value out of it. There are certainly some works that some students just don't get along with, and I can get a student to limp through a work for 3 or 4 weeks, but I don't want to drag them through a work for 7 or 8 or 9 weeks. And I think there's just a lot to be said for the value of starting fresh and going through the cycle of reading a book with a class and then repeating and then repeating. I think you get more value from teaching more short works than you do from teaching long works. Tip number 2, don't teach exhaustively. I don't think that you want to teach a work and try and squeeze everything out of the work that you possibly can. I like to tell my students that we're going to shoot for an 80% understanding and call ourselves successful. I can't think of any high school appropriate book that you could get students to 100% understand in the course of 3 or 4 weeks or even a semester. I think if you give yourself the goal of an 80% understanding, it's very realizable. Going along with that 80% understanding goal, I like to tell my students that we have 3 or 4 goals for the work, and I pick those in advance and we put them on the board so we know what we're working towards. Most frequently, I'm working with theme. Often, I'm working with character. Frequently, I'm working with some kind of device such as irony or juxtaposition. Sometimes we're zeroing in on setting. Sometimes we're working with a work in conjunction with some supplementary text so we can compare and contrast or apply. Anything more than 3 or 4 goals, and it starts to be too complicated, it gets to be too much for the students to keep track of, and it starts to feel less like pleasure and more like tedious work. And I think that we want our students to find reading pleasurable. We want them to meet goals and feel satisfied and accomplished that they've met those goals. We don't want to run them ragged. We don't want them to hate reading. My third tip is to use supplementary texts sparingly. I know teachers who can bring in poems and photographs and essays and add value to the work every single day that they teach the work. But I think that our primary goal is to work with the students and work with the text and to let the text do the work. And I think that often when we bring in too many supplementary texts, we start to confuse things. And for new teachers especially, I think that I would try and limit you to 1 or 2 supplementary texts per unit, and certainly no more than 1 supplementary text or feature per day, such as a photograph or a poem. Tip number 4, don't spend too much time building background. At the beginning of your unit, 1 day of background and context building where you talk about the author or the time period is usually enough. At the outside, I would spend 2 days of background building, and if I'm spending 2 days of background building, part of that is because I've sent my students home to do some research on their own, and they are bringing their research findings back and presenting to the class so that they are invested in the background building themselves. If you are stretching into 3 or 4 days of background building, you're definitely doing too much background and context building. Tip number 5 is to read the first few pages of the book together as a class. Always in a high quality piece of literature, the themes, the motifs, the devices that are going to be important, they begin to become evident in the first few pages, And if you read the first few pages as a class and you start pointing your students toward the small details that are going to snowball and accumulate and become big and important features of the text, they can become more focused readers as they move through the rest of the book. My sixth tip feeds off of my fifth tip, and that is don't read the book out loud to your students. If in the first day of class you guys are bouncing between paragraphs and having different students read different paragraphs and you take a paragraph or two, that's not a problem. But in high school, you should not be reading books to your students. The point of reading a book with your students in high school is never for them to understand the book and have been exposed to the book. The point of students reading books in high school is always that students read the book so that they become better readers. The texts that your students will read later in life are likely going to be analogous in some ways to the texts that they read in high school. And so by having read those books themselves, they will have developed the strategies and techniques required of them to apply to the books that they will read later in life. If you spend class periods reading to your students, they do not get to develop those strategies. They don't become better readers, and you will have failed your students. Tip number 7, I like to give students time to read in class. I like to talk about inertia. I think that at the beginning of a book, a great effort is required to get into the book. And so I like to give my students 10, 15, 20, even 25 minutes of focused reading time. I don't give them 25 minutes early in the year. We would build towards that. And I like to walk around the room and make sure they're using that reading time to sink the hook, to get the book going, to get invested in that book. If you're assigning 40 or 60 or 80 pages of homework over a 2-day span or over the weekend, and you can tell your students that they can knock out 10, 20, 25% of that in class, that's meaningful. And I am always in the modern era trying to help my students take part of the load off of their mental plate because I know they have homework in other classes. And if we can teach them to clear their mental plate as quickly as possible, it helps keep their depression and anxiety and frustration at bay. Tip number 8 has to do with plays. Plays were meant to be read aloud, and I know a lot of teachers who love to teach entire plays in class, who rejoice in moving the desks to the side and assigning parts and having the students get theatrical. I like to curve my desks into an arc and have a small stage area in the front of the room and have students stand in the front and act. And my students take pleasure in that also. I would say, though, that when you assign a play, while you should read most of the play in class, you should never read all of the play in class. There should always be at least one act, at least a quarter or a third of the play that you send the students home to read on their own. While a lot of students will really enjoy reading the whole play out loud in class, you do have those other students who would really rather read on their own. And reading a play is a skill that needs to be developed just as well as reading a novel or a short story or a poem. And if we don't give our students some time to read plays and decipher plays on their own, if they don't have a chance to read lines, parse those lines, maybe look up some words, um, do the unpacking work in the privacy of their own bedrooms or at their kitchen tables, I don't think that our students get the chance to develop quite as well as they ought to get the chance to develop as readers. Tip number 9 is to limit your lecturing. The majority of the work should be done by the book and the author of the book. The rest of the work should mostly be done by the students who are deciphering the work. You are really just a facilitator. When I teach a book, I try and limit my lecturing to 15 or 20 minutes. If I lecture for 20 or 25 minutes or 30, then I'm probably going to be splitting that lecture into 2 parts that have some activity come between the two of them. Much of the time when I'm lecturing, it's not really a pure lecture, but rather me guiding students through some kind of Q&A session, some kind of guided discussion where a lot of the talking, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the ruminating, a lot of the unpacking of the text is done by the students, and I'm just asking the probing questions that get them to do the work of understanding the book. Tip number 10 is to be cautious of making the book tedious. This goes along with my second tip of trying not to teach exhaustively. I would caution against worksheeting students through books. I would caution against having students do packets all the way through books. If you're going to have students annotate their way through books, I think that the annotation is a strong and effective strategy, but if you're having students annotate on a first time through and they are frequently having to put down the book and pick up a pen or a highlighter or a sticky pad of yellow stickies to put into their book, I think it interrupts the dream of reading the book and it makes students less fond of their reading. I like to find a few good questions to ask my students in class. I like to ask a few probing questions for homework to send home with them. I like them to come back to class after they've done the reading and then give them 3 or 4 pages that I in particular want them to annotate very closely so we can practice those annotation skills. I ultimately want my students to delight in reading, to have reading fill them with wonder, to ponder the topics kind of almost at their leisure, because I'd like to teach a class that produces students who want to read and who will read in the future and who have the skills to do so and haven't been worn out and burned out by the process of reading exhaustively and tediously. That having been said, my last tip is that you must keep your students accountable for reading. If you want your students to grow to love reading, they have to do the reading to begin with. They have to push that heavy boulder, they have to get it going, and they need some kind of motivation to do so. If they know that you're not going to hold them accountable for reading, if they know that they can show up for class without doing the reading and you will just tell them everything they missed or their classmates' discussions will catch them up, they will not do the reading and they will not grow to love reading. I like to think about Bloom's taxonomy when I quiz my students. At the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, you have recall or remember. On the next level, you have understand. On the third level, you have apply before you get to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize. Sometimes we call synthesize create. And when I quiz my students on reading, I always stick to the bottom 2 foundational levels. I quiz my students on recall and remembrance, that is, what actually happened. And I quiz them on understanding, that is, when you were reading, were you understanding, were you parsing, were you unpacking what you were reading? I never ask my students uh, application questions in quizzes. I never ask my students analytical questions in quizzes. The quizzes are always the foundations that we will then build on in the rest of the class discussion so that having demonstrated their recall and understanding, then we can apply our understandings. Then we can analyze and break down texts. Then we can apply criteria to evaluate the texts. Then we can synthesize the texts with the supplemental texts and create new understandings. I hope this one was helpful for you. I have a few more tips in another video I hope to produce in the next 2 or 3 days and get out by Sunday night. If you have questions that you'd like to put in the comments, I'd love to see them. If you're a veteran teacher who has feedback or your own ideas, I'd love to see them. Thank you guys so much. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if you would. Happy teaching.